The Paper That Ended Everything. Section 1. The Quiet Before the Storm. The air in the courtroom was stagnant, smelling of old wood and the clinical scent of floor wax. I sat at the mahogany table, my hands resting flat against the surface. I didn't fidget. I didn't look at Elena. I could feel her presence, though. A sharp, expensive perfume that seemed to claim the room just as she intended to claim the ranch. To my left, my lawyer, Miller, was reviewing a stack of documents that had become my life over the last 6 months. Across the aisle, Elena's legal team looked like they were already celebrating. They had reason to be confident. On paper, I was a man about to lose his soul. The ranch wasn't just land. It was 4 generations of my family's sweat, blood, and stubborn refusal to fail. 8,000 acres of Montana high country that Elena had once called quaint when we were dating. Now she called it a distributable asset. Along with the $8.5 million she claimed I had hidden in offshore accounts during our 7-year marriage. I looked at the back of my father's hands in my mind, calloused, scarred, and always smelling of cedar and diesel. I realized then that Elena didn't want the land for the history. She wanted it because she knew it was the only thing left that could actually hurt me. I stayed silent because I knew that in this arena, words are often just rope you give your opponent to hang you with. Her lead attorney, a man named Sterling who wore a suit that cost more than my first tractor, stood up. He began a practiced monologue about marital contributions and lifestyle expectations. He painted a picture of a devoted wife who had sacrificed her prime years to help manage a sprawling estate, only to be cast aside. I watched him. I didn't blink. I didn't scowl. I simply observed the way his tie shifted when he lied. That was the moment I understood the depth of the betrayal. It wasn't just the divorce. It was the meticulous reconstruction of our history. Elena sat there in a soft gray dress, the picture of understated elegance and victimhood. She had spent 2 years planning this exit while I was out fixing fences in the biting wind of November. She had been photographing ledgers, copying emails, and whispering into the ears of people I thought were my friends. She had turned my own world into a weapon against me. The pressure in the room was physical. The judge, a stern woman named Gable, looked over her spectacles at me. She saw a man in a plain Western suit, a man whose family owned half the valley but looked like he belonged in a hardware store. She saw the aggressive and secretive husband Elena's team had described in their filings. I could feel the social imbalance shifting. In this room, my competence in the field meant nothing. My status as a provider was being reframed as a method of control. I was being dismantled piece by piece in front of a court record that would never forget. As Sterling reached the crescendo of his opening statement, he pointed toward the projected screen. He showed photos of the ranch house, the new stables, and the private plane. "Mr. Dalton treats this empire as a personal kingdom," he said, his voice dropping to a somber tone, while my client was relegated to the role of a mere accessory, hidden away from the true financial workings of the very life she helped build. "We are here to ensure that the gates of the Dalton Ranch are finally open to the justice of the law." I leaned back slightly. My heart rate hadn't increased. I knew something they didn't. I knew that Elena's greed had a blind spot, a hole in the center of her logic that was about to become a vacuum. She thought she had mapped every inch of my finances, every corner of the trust, and every clause in our prenuptial agreement. She believed she had found the one vulnerability that would bypass the Dalton family's legendary legal protections. The silence I maintained wasn't a sign of defeat. It was a tactical necessity. When you are being hunted, you don't scream. You wait for the hunter to step into the brush where you've hidden the steel. Elena glanced at me then, just a fleeting second, and I saw the smirk she couldn't quite hide. It was the look of someone who had already spent the money. She thought she had won. She thought the $8.5 million and the deed to the North Range were already hers. But she had forgotten one thing about the men in my family. We don't just keep ledgers, we keep secrets. "Your Honor," Miller said, standing up for the first time. His voice was dry, lacking the theatricality of Sterling. "We have listened to the narrative provided by the petitioner. It is compelling. However, before we proceed to the cross-examination of the financial experts, there is a threshold matter of standing regarding the North Range and the specific accounts mentioned." Sterling scoffed, a loud, performative sound. "The standing is clear, Your Honor. The ranch is a marital asset under the 2018 amendment." Judge Gable nodded slowly. "I'm inclined to agree, Mr. Miller, unless you have something new to bring to this bench." I felt the weight of the document in Miller's briefcase. It was a single sheet of paper, yellowed at the edges, signed decades before Elena and I had even met. It was the trap I had been holding since the day she served me papers at the dinner table. As Miller reached into his bag, the room went quiet. I didn't look at Elena. I looked at the judge. "We do, Your Honor," Miller said softly, "but it requires a closed session for the initial review, as it involves a third party's privacy that predates this marriage by 40 years. The smirk on Elena's face flickered. Just for a millisecond, she looked at her lawyer, who whispered something dismissive. They thought it was a delay tactic. They thought I was grasping at straws. They had no idea that the very ground they were standing on was about to liquefy. Section 2. The Architecture of Deception. The judge granted a 10-minute recess before deciding on the closed session. I walked out into the hallway, refusing to look at the circus of reporters and friends who had gathered to watch the Dalton fall. I stood by the tall windows overlooking the city, which looked so small and fragile compared to the mountains back home. I realized that Elena's entire strategy was built on the assumption that I was a simple man. She saw the mud on my boots and assumed there was mud in my brain. I stayed silent because responding to her provocations in the hallway would only feed the image she wanted to project. She walked past me, her heels clicking like a metronome, and whispered, "It's over, John. Just give them what they want and you can keep the house. I just want my share." I didn't turn my head. I didn't acknowledge she existed. That was the moment I understood that her share was a moving target. If I gave her the $8.5 million, she'd want the water rights. If I gave her the water rights, she'd want the mineral leases. The internal monologue in my head was a cold calculation. I had spent years loving this woman, or at least loving the version of her she allowed me to see. I had brought her into the inner sanctum of a family that values privacy above all else, and she had used that access to map the vaults. But Elena had made the mistake of thinking that because she saw the vault, she knew what was inside. She saw the numbers, but she didn't understand the law behind them. The psychological pressure was shifting. As we walked back into the courtroom, the atmosphere had changed. My calm was beginning to unnerve her. Usually, in these high-stakes divorces, the husband is angry. He's shouting at his lawyers. He's red-faced. He's desperate. I was none of those things. I was a man waiting for a clock to strike 12. "We will proceed with the closed session," Judge Gable announced, clearing the gallery. The doors were locked. Only the principals and their counsel remained. Sterling stood up, his confidence slightly frayed but still intact. "Your Honor, this is an unorthodox attempt to hide assets behind a veil of privacy. My client has a right to see every document that pertains to the Dalton Ranch. She lived there. She managed the staff. She is, for all intents and purposes, a co-owner." "Is she?" Miller asked, his voice echoing in the nearly empty room. He walked toward the bench and handed a single folder to the bailiff. "This document was recovered from the archives of the First National Bank of Helena. It is a conditional deed of trust and a life estate agreement executed in 1974. Elena frowned. 1974? She wasn't even born then. Neither was I, she whispered to Sterling, who shook his head. Irrelevant, Sterling said. Subsequent transfers and the marriage itself supersede any ancient trusts. Not this one, Miller said. Your Honor, if you look at page 3, section 4, the Dalton Ranch was never owned by my client's father in his personal capacity. It was held in a restricted sovereign trust for the benefit of the lineal heirs. But there is a specific clause regarding the 2,000 acres of the North Range, the very land Mrs. Dalton is claiming as her primary settlement. I watched Elena's face. She was pale now. She had done her homework, but she had studied the deeds from the last 20 years. She hadn't gone back 50. She hadn't looked at the foundation upon which the entire estate was built. She had assumed the North Range was just a name. The document, Miller continued, stipulates that the North Range is actually under a perpetual conservation and bloodline lease. It can never be sold, partitioned, or transferred to anyone who does not carry the Dalton DNA. Furthermore, any attempt to litigate for the ownership of this land by a non-lineal party triggers an immediate interim clause regarding the cash assets of the estate. The judge's eyes widened. She flipped through the pages quickly. The room felt like the oxygen was being sucked out of it. Sterling was leaning over the table, trying to see the paper. Elena's hand was shaking as she reached for her water glass. Mr. Miller, Judge Gable said, her voice sharp, are you telling this court that by simply filing for this specific land, the petitioner has forfeited her right to the cash settlement she's seeking? That is exactly what the 1974 document dictates, Your Honor, Miller said. It was designed by my client's grandfather to protect the ranch from exactly this type of external acquisition. It states that any spouse who seeks to dissolve the land through legal action waives all claims to any liquid assets held by the Dalton family trusts, specifically the $8.5 million she's currently claiming. I realized then that the trap hadn't been set by me. It had been set 50 years ago by a man who knew that one day someone like Elena would come along. My grandfather had seen the future. He had known that the land was the bait and the greed was the hook. Elena looked at me, her eyes wide with a mixture of rage and pure, unadulterated fear. The silence in the room was deafening. The $8.5 million she thought she had secured was now sitting on a razor's edge. If the judge upheld this document, Elena wouldn't just lose the ranch, she would walk away with nothing. Absolutely nothing. The rising psychological pressure reached a breaking point. Sterling started stammering, trying to find a loophole, a way to discredit a document that had been sitting in a bank vault since the Nixon administration. But the signatures were notarized. The trust was ironclad. I stayed silent. I didn't need to speak. The paper was doing all the talking for me. I looked at the clock on the wall. The morning was half over. By the time the sun set, the life Elena had built on lies was going to be a memory. I need time to review this, Sterling gasped. This is a blindside. We need an adjournment. The court will take it under advisement, Judge Gable said, but she didn't look at Sterling. She looked at Elena, and for the first time, there was no sympathy in her eyes. As we stood to leave the closed session, Elena stepped toward me. Her mask had finally shattered. You knew, she hissed, her voice low so the judge wouldn't hear. You let me file those papers knowing this was there. I looked at her. Truly looked at her, for the last time. I didn't let you do anything, Elena, I said quietly. You chose the land. You should have chosen the truth. But as I walked out of the courtroom, a cold thought struck me. The document was real, and the clause was devastating. But there was a second page to that agreement that even Miller hadn't seen yet. A page that changed the definition of lineal heir in a way that would make this entire victory taste like ash in my mouth if it came to light. Section 3. The Ghost in the Machine. The hallway outside the courtroom felt miles long. Elena's legal team had retreated into a private conference room, their voices raised in muffled, frantic arguments. I sat on a stone bench, watching the dust motes dance in the shafts of light hitting the floor. My calm wasn't a mask, it was a consequence of exhaustion. When you've spent months watching someone you once loved try to dismantle your heritage, you eventually run out of anger. You just become a witness to the wreckage. I stayed silent because I was thinking about that second page. The 1974 agreement was a masterpiece of legal defense, but it contained a final paragraph that I had kept hidden even from Miller. It defined lineal heir not just by blood, but by a specific acknowledgement of paternity filed with the county. It was a fail-safe meant to prevent illegitimate claims, but in the modern era of DNA and shifting family secrets, it was a landmine. I realized that if Sterling dug deep enough, he wouldn't just find a way to challenge the trust. He'd find a way to challenge the very legitimacy of my father's claim to the North Range. The power I held was a glass blade, sharp enough to cut Elena, but fragile enough to shatter in my hand. That was the moment I understood that this wasn't just a divorce anymore. It was a game of archaeological warfare. Elena's greed had led her to the door, but my grandfather's paranoia had built the lock. I watched Miller walk toward me, his face a mixture of triumph and concern. He sat down, leaning in close. "The judge is rattled, John. That document is a nuclear strike. But Sterling is a rat. He's going to go to the archives. He's going to look for the filing receipts. Are we clean?" I looked Miller in the eye and lied. "The document is authentic, Paul. That's all that matters." The internal monologue in my head was screaming otherwise. I knew that the filing receipt for the 1974 trust had been amended in 1981. My father had mentioned it once, shortly before he died, his voice a whisper of regret. "Some things are better left under the topsoil, John," he'd said. At the time, I thought he was talking about the cattle we'd lost to the winter. Now I knew he was talking about the foundation of our name. The pressure began to mount as the lunch recess ended. The gallery was still barred, but the air in the courtroom had turned freezing. Elena was no longer looking at her phone or adjusting her hair. She was staring at the table, her hands clenched so tightly her knuckles were white. She had realized that the $8.5 million, the money she had already mentally spent on a villa in France and a new life in the city, was tied to a piece of land she could never own. Sterling stood up, but he didn't look at the judge. He looked at me. "Your Honor, while we acknowledge the existence of the 1974 trust, we question its in terrorem applicability. Specifically, we believe the definition of the Dalton line is being used as a discriminatory tool to circumvent marital property laws. We request an immediate subpoena for the full, unredacted history of the trust's amendments." The social imbalance was shifting again. Miller stood up to object, but I saw the look on Judge Gable's face. She was a fair woman, but she hated being played. "Mr. Miller," she said, her voice echoing, "if there are amendments that clarify the standing of this trust, they must be produced. I will not rule on a forfeiture of $8.5 million based on a partial record." I felt the sweat prickle at the back of my neck. This was the moment where the hunter becomes the hunted. I had used the document to stop her momentum, but in doing so, I had invited the court to look into a closet that hadn't been opened in 40 years. The rising psychological pressure was no longer about the money. It was about the Dalton name. If the 1981 amendment came to light, it wouldn't just be Elena who lost everything. The entire ranch, the thousands of acres, the legacy. It could all be tied up in probate for a decade. I stayed silent, watching the court reporter's fingers fly over the keys. I realized that Elena saw my hesitation. For the first time that day, she looked up. She saw the slight tension in my jaw. She was a predator. She could smell the shift in the wind. She leaned over and whispered to Sterling. He nodded, a slow, predatory grin spreading across his face. "Furthermore, Your Honor," Sterling added, "we have reason to believe that the lineal heir status of the current estate holder is, let's say, a matter of some administrative curiosity. We aren't just looking at the trust, we're looking at the bloodline." The cliffhanger hung in the air like a guillotine. Elena wasn't just going for the money anymore. She was going for the roots. She wanted to prove I wasn't who I said I was, just so she could watch the mountains crumble behind me. Section 4. The Shadow of the Father. The afternoon session turned into a grueling interrogation of history. Miller was fighting a rearguard action, trying to limit the scope of the discovery, but the judge was curious now. And a curious judge is the most dangerous thing in a courtroom. I sat there, a passenger in my own life, as they debated the legal definitions of issue and descendant. I stayed silent because I was busy retracing my father's steps. I remembered the way he used to look at the North Range, not with pride, but with a kind of haunting reverence. He had spent his life protecting that land, but he had also spent it hiding the truth about how he'd kept it. The internal monologue was a cycle of realization. I had walked into this courtroom thinking I was the hero of a story about a man protecting his home. Now, I was starting to feel like the villain in a story about a family built on a lie. The status threat was no longer coming from Elena's greed, but from my own heritage. If Sterling found the 1981 filing, he would see that my father had paid off a local clerk to verify a birth certificate that didn't exist in the state records. The $8.5 million was a distraction. The real stakes were the very ground I stood on. Elena noticed the change in the room's energy. She began to regain her composure. She straightened her dress, took a sip of water, and actually smiled at me. It wasn't a smile of affection. It was the smile of a person who had found the loose thread in a sweater and was about to pull. She knew I was hiding something. She didn't know what it was yet, but she knew it was big enough to make me sweat. "Mr. Dalton," Sterling said, turning toward me, "is it true that your father, Elias Dalton, spent 3 months in Switzerland in the summer of 1973, just before this trust was finalized?" "Objection! Relevance!" Miller shouted. "I'll allow it," Gable said. "Contextual history of the trust's formation is relevant to the petitioner's claim of fraud." I looked at Sterling. "He traveled often," I said, my voice steady despite the hammer in my chest. "Business interests," my voice steady despite the hammer in my chest. "Business interests," Sterling repeated, mocking my tone. Or was it to settle the affairs of a woman who was never mentioned in the family history? A woman whose lineal contribution might make your claim to that ranch complicated. The pressure in the room was suffocating. I realized that Elena hadn't just been copying emails. She had hired a private investigator to go back decades. She had dug into the one part of my life I thought was sacred. She was willing to burn down the entire Dalton legacy just to get her hands on the ashes. The internal monologue turned dark. I stayed silent because I was deciding whether to fold or to double down. If I folded, I'd lose the $8.5 million and probably a significant portion of the ranch. If I doubled down, I risked losing everything: the name, the land, and the memory of my father. I looked at Elena. She was enjoying this. She loved the chaos. She loved seeing the stoic John Dalton finally start to crack. That was the moment I understood that restraint was no longer my only weapon. I needed to move the target. I looked at the folder Miller had on the table. There was another document there, one that Elena didn't know I had. It wasn't about the ranch, it was about her. Your Honor, I said, interrupting the back and forth, if we are going to discuss the full, unredacted histories of the parties involved, I believe we should also look at the petitioner's bank records from her business trips to Miami last year. The smile vanished from Elena's face. The transition was instant. Her skin went from a healthy glow to a dull, ashen gray. She looked at me, her eyes pleading for a second before they turned into shards of ice. "That's a private matter," Sterling shouted. "Is it?" I asked, leaning forward. "Because, according to the same 1974 trust that protects the North Range, any spouse found to be engaging in financial malfeasance against the estate's primary holder forfeits their standing regardless of the bloodline." I had stayed silent long enough. I had watched her play her hand, and now I was showing her that I had been counting the cards. I knew about the $2 million she had moved into a shell company during our 3rd year of marriage. I knew about the consultancy fees she had been paying to her brother. I had kept that information as a last resort, hoping we could end this with some shred of dignity. But she had gone after my father. The psychological dominance shifted back to my side of the table. The judge looked from me to Elena. The victim was now looking very much like a thief. The rising pressure was now squarely on Elena's shoulders. If she pushed for the trust's history, I would push for her bank records. We were standing in a field of dry grass, and we both had matches. "We will take a 15-minute recess," Judge Gable said, her voice sounding tired. "Counsel, I suggest you talk to your clients. I want a resolution, or I want a full disclosure from both sides, and I promise you nobody will like what happens if I have to dig the holes myself." As the judge left the bench, Elena didn't move. She sat there, staring at the empty seat. I stood up, adjusting my jacket. I didn't feel victorious. I felt like I was standing in the middle of a graveyard. "John," she whispered as I passed, "don't do this. If you open those records, they'll see everything. You should have thought about that before you went to Switzerland," I said quietly. But as I walked out, I realized I had made a tactical error. By threatening her with the Miami records, I had backed a cornered animal into a position where she had only one way out. And that way out involved a phone call she was making right now, a phone call to a man who knew exactly what had happened in 1981. Section 5. The Architect of Shadows. The courthouse hallway felt colder than the Montana winter. I stood by the vending machine, not because I was hungry, but because I needed a moment where no one was looking at me. My reflection in the glass was a stranger's, a man whose face was etched with the strain of holding a crumbling empire together. I realized that the $8.5 million Elena was chasing was just a number on a ledger, but the secrets she was unearthing were the very marrow of my bones. She wasn't just suing me for a divorce. She was suing me for a divorce. She was suing me for my identity. I stayed silent because I saw her through the glass of the conference room door. She was on her cell phone, her posture rigid, her free hand gesturing wildly. She was calling Marcus Thorne. Marcus had been my father's fixer for 30 years, the man who knew where the bodies were buried and who had held the shovel. If Elena had reached him, the 1981 amendment wasn't just a threat. It was a death sentence for the Dalton legacy. I understood then that I had underestimated her. She didn't just want the money, she wanted to burn the house down while I was still inside it. The internal monologue in my head was a frantic calculation of loyalty. Marcus was a man of cold utility. He had been loyal to my father, but my father was dead. In the vacuum of power, loyalty usually goes to the highest bidder or the one with the most leverage. I had assumed Marcus would stay in the shadows, but Elena had a way of bringing out the worst in people. She had likely promised him a piece of the North Range, a piece of the very land he had spent his life protecting in the dark. The psychological pressure was no longer a slow burn, it was a forest fire. I returned to the courtroom as the bailiff announced the judge's return. The social imbalance had flipped. Elena was no longer the trembling victim. She sat with a terrifying, quiet confidence. She didn't look at her lawyers. She looked at the clock. She was waiting for a signal. I felt the status threat like a physical weight on my chest. If Thorne walked through those doors, the lineal heir clause would become a noose. "Mr. Miller," Judge Gable began, her voice echoing in the hollow room, "before we proceed with the subpoena for the Miami records, has there been any movement toward a settlement? I'm seeing a lot of scorched earth and very little common sense." Miller looked at me. I looked at the floor. "Your Honor," Sterling interrupted, standing up with a flourish, "the petitioner is no longer interested in a settlement based on the previous terms. In light of new information regarding the 1981 administrative filings, we are moving to void the 1974 trust in its entirety due to foundational fraud." The room went silent. Fraud. It was the one word that could bypass every protection my grandfather had built. If the trust was founded on a lie, specifically a lie about who I was, then the land, the money, and the heritage were all up for grabs. I realized that the silence I had maintained was now my only shield. I didn't react. I didn't gasp. I simply watched the door. That was the moment I understood the true nature of the trap. Elena hadn't just been looking for a document, she had been looking for a person. And that person was now standing in the back of the courtroom. Marcus Thorne, in a gray coat that smelled of old tobacco and secrets, leaned against the door frame. He didn't look at me, he looked at the judge. The pressure reached an agonizing peak. Sterling smiled, a predatory gleam in his eyes. "We have a witness, Your Honor, someone who can speak directly to the authenticities of the Dalton lineage and the 1981 amendments. We ask that Marcus Thorne be called to the stand." I stayed silent. My heart was a drum in my ears. I looked at Elena, and for the first time, I saw the true depths of her betrayal. She wasn't just taking the ranch, she was taking my father's name and dragging it through the mud to ensure I had nothing left to stand on. She wanted me to be a ghost in my own home. "Mr. Thorne?" Judge Gable asked, looking toward the back of the room. "Are you prepared to testify regarding these matters?" Marcus stepped forward. The sound of his boots on the hardwood was like the ticking of a bomb. I realized that the next 60 seconds would determine the rest of my life. He reached the witness stand, his eyes finally meeting mine. They were cold, unreadable, and ancient. Section 6. The Weight of the Blood. The air in the room seemed to vanish as Marcus Thorne took the oath. He was a man who belonged to a different era, an era of handshakes and hushed conversations in the back of smoke-filled bars. I watched him sit down, his presence dwarfing the legal teams. He was the keeper of the Dalton shadow, and today he was the one holding the light. I stayed silent because any word from me would be an admission of fear. I realized that Elena was leaning forward, her breath shallow, her eyes fixed on Marcus like he was a god delivering a verdict. She thought she had him. She thought she had bought the one man who could break me. But she didn't know Marcus like I did. She didn't understand that for men like Marcus, secrets aren't just currency, they are a religion. The internal monologue was a sequence of memories. I remembered Marcus and my father standing by the creek in 1981. I was just a boy, hidden in the tall grass. I saw them exchanging a heavy envelope. I saw the look on my father's face, not greed, but a desperate, bone-deep protection. He wasn't trying to steal a legacy, he was trying to save a child. I understood then that the fraud Sterling was shouting about was actually an act of love, however twisted the legalities were. The rising psychological pressure shifted as Sterling began his questioning. "Mr. Thorne, You were the primary administrative consultant for Elias Dalton during the 1981 filing period, correct? I was, Marcus said, his voice a low rumble. And you are aware of the specific amendments made to the North Range Trust regarding the definition of lineal heir. I am. Is it not true? Sterling leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, that those documents were altered to reflect a biological reality that did not exist? That the current defendant, John Dalton, is not, in fact, the biological issue of Elias Dalton? The courtroom felt like it was tilting on its axis. Elena let out a small, sharp breath of triumph. I felt the status threat reach its ultimate conclusion. I was being unmade. I was being unmade. I was being told, in front of the law, that I was a squatter on my own land. The social imbalance was total. I was no longer the master of the ranch. I was an imposter. I stayed silent. I looked at Marcus. He was looking at the judge, his face a mask of granite. Mr. Thorne, Judge Gable prompted, please answer the question. Was there fraud involved in the 1981 filing? Marcus turned his head slowly toward Elena. He looked at her for a long time, so long that she began to fidget, her confidence flickering like a dying candle. Then he looked at me. There was a filing, Marcus said clearly. And there was an amendment. But Mr. Sterling has the story backwards. The pressure in the room shifted so violently it felt like a physical blow. Elena's smile faltered. Sterling frowned. What do you mean backwards? Elias Dalton didn't alter those papers to claim a son that wasn't his, Marcus said, his voice gaining a hard, rhythmic edge. He altered them to protect a son from a woman who had already tried to sell him once. The fraud wasn't against the state. It was a protective barrier against a biological mother who had signed away her rights for a payout in Switzerland in 1973, a woman whose estate the petitioner, Elena Dalton, has been secretly communicating with for the last 8 months. I felt the ground solidify beneath me. I stayed silent, but my mind was racing. Elena's face went from pale to ghostly white. She hadn't just been looking for a secret, she had been trying to find a way to bring a secondary claimant into the mix to bypass the in terrorem clause. She had been digging into my birth mother's history, trying to find a loophole that would give her a piece of the pie through a different door. "That's a lie!" Elena shouted, breaking the silence. "Your Honor, this witness is biased. Sit down, Mrs. Dalton." Judge Gable snapped. She turned back to Marcus. Explain the payouts in 1973. The 1974 trust was created specifically because the biological mother attempted to blackmail the Dalton family, Marcus said, his voice cold and precise. The $8.5 million the petitioner is seeking, it's ironically the exact inflation-adjusted amount that was paid out to keep that woman away from this boy. And I have the signed 1973 release right here, which stipulates that any future claim by her or anyone acting on her behalf, including a spouse who discovers the secret, nullifies all marital property rights. The cliffhanger hit the room like a thunderclap. Marcus reached into his coat and pulled out a document that looked even older than the one Miller had. It wasn't just a deed, it was a ghost. Elena looked at the paper as if it were a snake. She realized that by digging into the past, she hadn't found a weapon to destroy me. She had found the very thing that would legally erase her from my life. The question now wasn't whether I would lose the ranch. The question was whether Elena would leave this courtroom in handcuffs. Section 7. The Collapse of the House of Cards. The silence in the courtroom was no longer a vacuum. It was a weight. It pressed down on Elena until her shoulders slumped, her polished exterior finally cracking like cheap porcelain. I sat perfectly still, my hands resting in the same position they had been in since 9 in the morning. I realized that the $8.5 million she had coveted wasn't just a number. It was a ghost of a debt my father had paid to protect my peace. Elena hadn't just been greedy, she had been a gravedigger. She had reached into the darkest year of my family's history and tried to pull out a profit. I stayed silent because I was watching the realization dawn on Judge Gable. The judge wasn't looking at the law anymore. She was looking at a betrayal so profound it transcended the civil code. The document Marcus Thorne held was a clean break agreement from 1973, witnessed by a high-ranking official and sealed with the family crest. It didn't just protect the land, it protected me. And Elena, in her desperation to bypass the trust, had inadvertently triggered a clause that labeled her an accomplice to the very extortion my father had died trying to bury. The internal monologue in my head was a cold, rhythmic pulse. I understood now why my father never spoke of her. He hadn't been ashamed of me, he had been protecting me from a woman who saw a child as a transaction. Elena had found that woman's trail, and instead of closing the book, she had tried to write a new chapter of theft. I realized that every business trip she took, every late-night consultation she had, was spent courting a shadow from my past just to ensure I had no future. The rising psychological pressure shifted entirely onto Elena's legal team. Sterling was no longer smirking. He was frantically whispering to his co-counsel, his eyes darting toward the door as if he were looking for an exit. The social imbalance had been corrected. I wasn't the imposter anymore. I was the survivor of a 50-year-old crime that my wife had tried to finish. The status threat had reversed. It was Elena whose character was now being dismantled in a public record. "Your Honor," Miller said, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "In light of Mr. Thorne's testimony and the 1973 release, we move for an immediate dismissal of the petitioner's claims. Furthermore, we request that the court refer this matter to the district attorney for investigation into attempted extortion and conspiracy to defraud the Dalton estate." Elena's head snapped up. "No," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "John, tell them I didn't know about the 1973 agreement. I thought I was finding your real family." I looked at her, and for the first time, I spoke without being prompted. "You weren't looking for my family, Elena. You were looking for a way to break the one you actually had." That was the moment I understood that the victory wouldn't feel like a celebration. It felt like a funeral. The woman I had shared a bed with for 7 years had looked into my history and saw only a vulnerability to exploit. The silence that followed my words was the final nail. The judge leaned over her bench, her face a mask of disappointment. "Mrs. Dalton," Judge Gable said, her voice dropping to a dangerous level, "this court does not take kindly to being used as a tool for generational blackmail. You claim the defendant was hiding assets. It appears he was hiding a trauma you chose to weaponize." The cliffhanger hung over the room as the judge signaled for her clerk. She was no longer debating the distribution of the ranch. She was deciding the fate of Elena's freedom. As the bailiff stepped closer to the petitioner's table, I realized that the true secret, the one Marcus Thorne hadn't mentioned, was still tucked away in the 1981 amendment. And if the judge looked at the back of the 1973 release, she would see the one thing that could still destroy the Dalton name forever. Section 8. The Silent Dominance of Truth. The final hour of the trial felt like a dream. The courtroom remained locked, the public still barred from the truth. Judge Gable reviewed the 1973 release with a magnifying glass, her eyes scanning the faded ink of my father's signature. I stayed silent, watching Marcus Thorne. He was still standing by the witness box, his face unreadable. He had done what my father had paid him to do. He had held the line. I stayed silent because I knew the power of the end. When a story concludes with a roar, people remember the noise. When it concludes with a whisper, they remember the truth. Elena sat in her chair, a shell of the woman who had walked in that morning. She wasn't fighting anymore. She wasn't even crying. She was simply waiting for the inevitable. The $8.5 million was gone. The The ranch was untouchable. Her reputation in the valley was a scorched field. The internal monologue in my head was finally at peace. I stayed silent because the mountains don't need to explain themselves. They just exist. They endure the wind and the winter, and they remain when everything else has turned to dust. I realized that my father's fraud in 1981 wasn't about blood. It was about choosing a legacy. He chose me. And today, by refusing to engage in her drama, I had chosen him. The quiet power shift was complete. The consequences unfolded without a single shout or insult. Judge Gable closed the folder and looked at us. The petitioner's claims are denied in their entirety. The in terrorem clause of the 1974 trust is upheld. Mrs. Dalton, you will receive exactly what the prenuptial agreement dictates for a fault-based dissolution, your personal effects, and the vehicle currently in your possession, nothing more. Sterling tried to speak, but the judge raised a hand. I'm not finished. I am referring the 1973 documents and the petitioner's recent communications with the Swiss estate to the federal authorities for a full audit. If a single dollar of Dalton money was used to facilitate this investigation, I will see to it that you are held in contempt of this court for the duration of the criminal trial. The moral closure was absolute. There was no public gloating. I didn't turn to her and say, "I told you so." I didn't look for the cameras. I simply stood up and adjusted my tie. I felt a quiet satisfaction not from her loss, but from the preservation of the soil. The North Range was safe. The Dalton name was still etched in the rock. The final emotion was a heavy, dignified peace. I walked toward Marcus Thorne as the room began to clear. He nodded to me, a short, sharp movement of the head. It was the first time in my life he had looked at me as an equal. I realized then that I wasn't just my father's son by law. I was his son by the way I held my ground. "It's done, John," Marcus whispered as I passed him. "Not quite," I said, looking at the 1973 release one last time. "There's still the matter of the 1981 amendment." "I burned the original filing this morning," Marcus said, his voice barely a breath. "The only version that exists now is the one the judge just validated. Your father was a smart man, John. He knew you'd be a better man than he was. He knew you'd know when to stay quiet." I walked out of the courthouse and into the bright, biting Montana sun. The air was crisp, smelling of pine and the coming snow. Elena was being led to her car by her lawyers, her head down, her expensive dress fluttering in the wind. She looked small. She looked like a stranger I had met once and forgotten. I climbed into my truck and started the engine. I didn't look back at the courthouse. I looked toward the horizon where the mountains touched the sky. I was going home. I was going to the North Range. And as I drove, I realized that the $8.5 million was a small price to pay for the silence of the land. The document that ended everything was now just a piece of paper in a vault. But the truth it protected was mine. I had won by doing nothing but remaining who I was, and as the gates of the Dalton Ranch appeared in the distance, I knew that for the first time in my life, the land wasn't just a legacy. It was mine, truly, legally, and forever. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe.